Off the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, barely visible on most maps, sits a small island shaped like a turtle. Today it is poor, forgotten, and quiet. But 3 centuries ago, this island hosted one of the most radical social experiments in human history. No king, no church, no nobility, only gunpowder, rum, and men who had decided to write their own rules. This is the real story of Tortuga. And the truth is far stranger than anything Hollywood has put on screen. To understand why Tortuga mattered, you first have to understand what the Caribbean looked like before the pirates arrived. It was a Spanish lake. After Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, the Spanish crown treated the entire Caribbean basin as personal property. They built fortified colonies across Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They enslaved indigenous populations on a massive scale. They extracted gold, silver, tobacco, and sugar and shipped it back to Europe in quantities that made Spain the wealthiest empire on earth. The Pope himself had formalized this arrangement in 1494, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal and leaving everyone else out entirely. England, France, and the Netherlands watched Spain grow rich and seethed. But Spain had forts, warships, and legal backing from Rome. Anyone who showed up uninvited was not just an intruder, they were a target. The French showed up anyway. In the early 1600s, French hunters and drifters began settling the western coastline of Hispaniola. These were not soldiers or diplomats. They were men who had nothing left in Europe. They escaped servants, wanderers, the desperate and the discarded. They survived by hunting wild cattle and pigs that the Spanish had originally brought to the island generations earlier and then abandoned. They smoked the meat over open fires called boucans. The French word for a man who cooks over a boucan is boucanier. In English, we call them buccaneers. These were not pirates yet. They were just trying to eat. Spain eventually noticed them. Spain sent soldiers. The settlements were burned, the cattle slaughtered, and the survivors driven into the sea. Those who escaped paddled across a narrow channel to a small mountainous island that the Spanish called La Tortuga and the French called Tortuga. It was roughly 25 miles long and 5 miles wide. Its northern coast was sheer cliff. Its southern shore had a natural harbor deep enough for large ships. Dense jungle covered its peaks and provided fresh water and cover. The Spanish had ignored it for over a century. The Buccaneers looked at it and immediately understood what they had found. Tortuga's geography was almost designed for outlaws. The cliffs on the northern side made any naval assault suicidal. The harbor on the southern shore could shelter a fleet. The jungle interior was nearly impenetrable to anyone who didn't already know it. And its location, sitting directly at the entrance to the Windward Passage, the main shipping route between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, meant that virtually every Spanish treasure fleet sailed within visual range of it. Word spread quickly among the unwanted men of the Atlantic world. Deserters from European navies, escaped indentured servants who had survived their years of bonded labor only to find themselves free and penniless in a hostile colony. Formerly enslaved people who had escaped or been freed. Petty criminals who had exhausted every other option. Men whose pasts were best not discussed. Tortuga absorbed all of them. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Because these men, stateless, lawless, with no government above them and no authority to answer to, did not collapse into pure chaos. They built something. It was violent and rough and soaked in rum, but it functioned. The first organizing principle of Tortuga was radical in its simplicity. If you were here, you were one of us. Your origin didn't matter. Your language didn't matter. What you had done before you arrived didn't matter. The island's community was genuinely multi-ethnic and multinational at a time when European societies were rigidly stratified by birth, religion, and nationality. A crude economy emerged organically. Meat was traded for ship supplies. Ship supplies were traded for weapons. Weapons ensured protection. Behind all of it, rum flowed constantly and cheaply. A successful pirate returning from a raid could spend an entire fortune in a matter of weeks. And this was not considered reckless. It was expected. The culture of Tortuga was explicitly and deliberately anti-accumulation. You went out, you took, you came back, you spent, and then you went out again. The Spanish attacked in 1629 and temporarily cleared the island. The Buccaneers came back. They always came back. English settlers from St. Kitts re-established a presence by 1630. The Spanish attacked again in 1635. Then in 1638, a man named Jean Levasseur arrived and changed everything permanently. Levasseur was a French Huguenot engineer, not a pirate, not a drifter, but a builder. He looked at the rocky promontory above Tortuga's harbor and he constructed a real fort. Not a wooden stockade, but a stone fortress cut from the cliff itself, with cannons positioned to cover every approach from the sea. He named it La Montagne, the mountain. From its walls, he could survey every ship entering or leaving the harbor. Levasseur then declared himself governor. He had no official appointment from France. He simply announced it, and the Buccaneers decided that a man who had just built them an impregnable fort had probably earned some authority. He taxed goods passing through the harbor. He maintained a rough version of order. He invited pirates to use Tortuga as a base, provided they shared a portion of their plunder with the fort's administration. Under Levasseur, Tortuga became more than a hiding spot. It became an economy, a pirate economy, but an economy nonetheless, with a tax system, a physical infrastructure, and a functional government of sorts. He lasted 12 years before two of his own lieutenants stabbed him to death over a dispute he had refused to resolve fairly. This outcome was entirely consistent with the spirit of Tortuga. The man who brought Tortuga to its peak was Bertrand d'Ogeron, a French colonial administrator who arrived in the 1660s with the rare quality of being pragmatic rather than idealist. D'Ogeron understood that from France. It came from the pirates. So rather than trying to suppress them, he formalized the existing system and made it work for everyone. Pirates and privateers operating out of Tortuga paid a percentage of their captures to the island's administration. In return, they received a safe harbor, reliable access to supplies and provisions, a marketplace for their plunder, and the protection of Levasseur's fort. It was, in essence, a franchise model for organized piracy. At its height in the 1660s and 1670s, Tortuga had a population of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people. Small by any measure, but its influence was enormous, because every pirate ship working the Western Caribbean eventually passed through its harbor. The main settlement along the southern shore had no urban planning whatsoever. Taverns, warehouses, ship repair yards, and dwellings were mixed together in arrangements that would have horrified any European city planner. The streets turned to mud when it rained and baked to cracked earth when it didn't. The taverns were the center of social life, and rum was so cheap and plentiful that fortunes genuinely evaporated in days. But beneath the chaos, there was structure. And that structure is the most interesting thing about Tortuga. Before any pirate voyage departed from Tortuga, the captain and crew would sign a document called the Articles. These were not formalities. They were genuine contracts, negotiated and agreed upon before a single sail was raised. The Articles specified the captain's authority and its limits. They laid out exactly what share of any plunder each crew member would receive. They included a compensation schedule for injuries sustained in service. Lose your right arm, you receive a specific number of pieces of 8. Lose an eye, a different amount. Lose a leg, another sum. The amounts were fixed in advance and agreed upon by everyone before departure. When you look at this honestly, it is more egalitarian than virtually any other institution operating in the Atlantic world at that time. English merchant sailors had no contracts, no guaranteed wages, and no compensation for injuries. Sailors in royal navies were subject to flogging and execution at their captain's discretion, with no appeal and no recourse. The pirates of Tortuga, by contrast, had invented a system of democratic contracts by themselves, for some of themselves, with no lawyers, no philosophers, and no institutional tradition to draw from. It went further than the Articles. The captain of a pirate ship was elected by the crew. If the crew decided their captain was making poor decisions, if he was reckless, or cowardly, or greedy beyond what the articles permitted, they could vote to remove him. This was not theoretical. It happened regularly. The quartermaster, who was responsible for distributing the plunder after a successful raid, was also elected and answered to the crew rather than the captain. This separation of powers was deliberate. It was specifically designed to prevent any single individual from taking more than his share. The historian Marcus Rediker, who has spent decades studying the culture of Atlantic piracy, argues that pirate ships of this era were among the most democratic institutions operating anywhere in the world at the time. It is a claim that sounds outrageous until you actually look at the alternatives, and then it becomes difficult to dispute. There was also a practice among the Buccaneers called matelotage, a formal partnership between two men, legally recognized within the Tortuga community, that included shared property rights, mutual obligations of care, and inheritance rights if one partner died. In a world where rank and birth determined nearly everything, here was a small island where men were choosing their own leaders, writing their own contracts, and creating legally recognized bonds of partnership. None of this makes Tortuga clean. The same pirates who voted on their articles were enslaving people they captured on other ships. The island existed within and depended upon the larger slave economy of the Caribbean. There is no way to tell this history without acknowledging that tension between an internal democracy and an external brutality that was often monstrous. But the tension is part of what makes Tortuga worth understanding. No history of Tortuga is complete without the individuals who turned it into legend. Asterisk Pierre Le Grand was a Frenchman whose story sounds invented and almost certainly wasn't. In the late 1640s, Le Grand was at sea north of Hispaniola with a crew of around 28 men in a small boat. They had been out for weeks. Food and water were running low. They had found nothing worth attacking. Then they spotted a Spanish galleon, one of the great treasure ships of the fleet, crewed by more than 300 men, vastly larger than Le Grand's little vessel. Attacking it was suicide by any rational calculation. Le Grand attacked anyway. He brought his men alongside the galleon in the darkness. Then, to ensure there was no possibility of retreat, he ordered his crew to bore holes in the bottom of their own boat. They climbed the sides of the galleon and found the Spanish captain playing cards in his cabin. They captured the ship intact. Le Grand sailed his prize back to France, collected his fortune, and by all accounts never returned to piracy. He had gambled everything on one attack, won completely, and had the wisdom to walk away immediately. He became a legend on Tortuga, not because of a long career, but because his single act proved what was possible for men with nothing left to lose. Asterisk, François L'Olonnais was a different kind of figure entirely. He had come to the Caribbean as an indentured servant, and the years of brutal servitude left him with a hatred of the Spanish that was extreme even by the standards of his time. L'Olonnais was not interested in raiding ships. He raided coastal cities. He tortured prisoners in ways that the surgeon Alexander Exquemelin, who sailed with the Buccaneers, and later published an account of their lives, described in detail, that is still disturbing to read. L'Olonnais sacked Maracaibo in Venezuela. He brought back enormous plunder to Tortuga. He was celebrated. His end came in the late 1660s when his ship wrecked on the coast of Central America. According to Exquemelin, he was eventually captured on the Darien Peninsula and met a death that matched the violence he had delivered to others across a decade of raiding. Asterisk, Henry Morgan stands above all of them, and Henry Morgan complicates the entire story in fascinating ways. Morgan was Welsh. He arrived in the Caribbean as a young man, and, by the 1660s, was one of the most capable military commanders operating in the region. He is often called a pirate, which is not quite accurate. Morgan operated under letters of marque, official documents issued by the English governor of Jamaica, authorizing him to attack Spanish ships and settlements. This made him, legally speaking, a privateer rather than a pirate. The distinction mattered enormously in court and not at all in practice. In 1668, Morgan attacked Portobello on the coast of Panama. Portobello was one of the most heavily fortified ports in the Spanish Caribbean. The city where silver from the mines of Peru was gathered before being shipped to Spain. Morgan took it anyway, through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer ruthlessness, and returned to Jamaica with an enormous haul. In 1671, Morgan did something that no privateer had attempted at scale. He assembled nearly 1,500 men, crossed the Isthmus of Panama through swamps and jungle and Spanish resistance, and attacked Panama City from the landward side. The one direction the city's defenders had never anticipated needing to defend. Panama City was among the wealthiest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Morgan burned it. The Spanish were furious. England and Spain had been technically at peace when the raid happened. Morgan was arrested, transported back to England, and put on trial. He was acquitted, then knighted, then appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Sir Henry Morgan spent his final years enforcing anti-piracy laws against the very same men he had once sailed beside. The age had a very dark sense of humor about such things. The turning point came in 1670, with the Treaty of Madrid between England and Spain. England agreed to stop issuing letters of marque to privateers attacking Spanish interests. Spain agreed to recognize English possession of Jamaica and other Caribbean territories. The deal solved a diplomatic problem and destroyed Tortuga's economic model at the same time. Morgan's Panama raid in 1671 was, in a sense, the final spasm of the old system. The letters of marque he was operating under were already outdated when he launched the attack. He knew this. He launched it anyway. In Jamaica, new governors began enforcing anti-piracy laws with genuine consequences. Pirate captains who had once been welcomed and celebrated in Port Royal were being hanged there. The message from every European colonial government was now clear and consistent. The era of tolerance was finished. Tortuga itself came under increasingly firm French control. The Buccaneers who remained began drifting east toward the western coast of Hispaniola, which would eventually become the French colony of Saint-Domingue. By 1700, Tortuga was no longer the center of anything. The economics had shifted as well. Spain had extracted most of the easily accessible gold and silver from the Americas. The treasure fleets were smaller and far better protected than they had been a generation earlier. The risk-reward calculation for attacking them no longer made sense. Pirates moved on, some north toward the coastlines of colonial North America, others east around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where the Mughal Empire's treasure ships offered new opportunities. The golden age of Tortuga was over in roughly 50 years. It had barely lasted a human lifetime. The land around Tortuga did not become peaceful. It became something else. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, established on the western third of Hispaniola, became, by the late 1700s, the most profitable colony in the world. Coffee, sugar, and cotton poured out of it in staggering quantities, all produced by the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. The violence that had characterized Tortuga was not eliminated. It was reorganized into something far larger and more systematic. In 1791, Saint-Domingue became the site of the only successful slave revolution in history. The Haitian Revolution lasted 13 years and ended in 1804 with the proclamation of the Republic of Haiti. The people who had been enslaved on the same soil that the Buccaneers had once roamed fought for their freedom and won it against the most powerful military forces Europe could send against them. Tortuga became part of Haiti after independence. Today it is called Île de la Tortue. Its population is around 25,000 people. It is among the poorest parts of one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The Fort Levasseur, built from the cliffs, is mostly rubble. The harbor that once sheltered hundreds of pirate ships now shelters fishing boats. Here is what tends to get lost in the romanticized versions of this history. The world outside Tortuga, in the 1650s and 1660s, was one of suffocating hierarchy. In England, France, and Spain, your position at birth determined almost everything about your life. The son of a nobleman was a nobleman. The son of a peasant was a peasant. The church told you what to believe, and the crown told you what to do, and neither institution particularly cared what you thought about the arrangement. On Tortuga, none of that applied. The elected captains, the articles signed before every voyage, the equal shares distributed by the quartermaster, the harbor that took in all comers, regardless of origin or background, these were not accidents. They were the deliberate inventions of men who had been at the bottom of the European social order and had decided to construct something different. They were also running their experiment at exactly the moment when European philosophers were beginning to ask, in the abstract, whether authority had to come from tradition and birth, or whether it could be built on consent. John Locke published his foundational work on government by consent in 1689, when Tortuga's golden age was already over. The American Declaration of Independence came in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789. None of those events were caused by pirates, but they were all answering the same question that the men of Tortuga had already answered, badly, violently, and with enormous human cost, decades earlier. Can people govern themselves? The Buccaneers of Tortuga said yes. They demonstrated it imperfectly and brutally, within a context of exploitation they never fully escaped. But they demonstrated it. Alexandra Exquemelin's account of the Buccaneers, published in 1678, became an immediate bestseller across Europe and was translated into multiple languages within a decade. It shaped how Europeans imagined the Caribbean for generations. Daniel Defoe's History of the Pirates followed in 1724. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island gave the world Long John Silver in 1883. Pirates of the Caribbean gave the world Jack Sparrow and put Tortuga back on the map for modern audiences. The fictional versions are not entirely wrong. The rum is accurate. The chaos is accurate. The sense that Tortuga was a place outside the normal rules of the world is accurate. What the fiction misses is the structure beneath the chaos. The articles, the elected captains, the quartermaster system, the matelotage agreements, the fact that what happened on Tortuga was not random disorder, but a deliberately constructed alternative to the order these men had fled and despised. Tortuga was, in the end, a dare. A collection of people the world had thrown away looked at the rules of the world and decided to write their own. They chose their leaders. They split their gains. They built contracts that gave even the lowest crew member rights that no European institution would have recognized. They created a functioning society in a place where no one expected one to exist, and they kept it running for 50 years. The empire they raised was violent and brief, and built on contradictions they never resolved. But on that small turtle-shaped rock in the Caribbean, the unwanted men of the Atlantic world proved something that the world around them was still arguing about in philosophy seminars and royal courts. They proved that even people with nothing can build something worth remembering. The island is still there, quiet now and largely forgotten. But the story it holds is more complicated and more interesting than any version of it that has ever been put on a cinema screen. A story about what human beings reach for when they finally have the chance to choose for themselves, and what they build when no one is there to stop them.